Okay. All right, here we go. All right. So, World War I is over. We are now living on the anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. There are a ton of books that have come out over the last few months and more to come about the origins of World War I. And as the years go by, then we'll get more and more books about the origins of Bolshevism and fascism and Nazism. But for now, let's focus on what happens after World War I is over. The war is over in 1918. We have 40 million casualties from the war, dead, missing, and wounded. We have the outbreak of the Spanish plague, the bubonic plague, which leads to upwards of 80 million more dead. World War I destroys the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. It ushers in a whole new world. And it's no coincidence that in the interwar period between the end of World War I, 1918, and the beginning of World War II, 1939, a lot happens on this planet, which can only be traceable to the trauma of World War I, and we are still living with the legacies of what developed in the 20s and 30s. Specifically, I'm talking about the rise of Bolshevism to power in Russia, which later on we'll talk about the Cold War, the struggle between America and Russia, fascism in Italy, the destruction of democracy in Italy, and Italians are still coming to grips with what fascism means in their history, Nazism in Germany, which has endless legacies, one of which was this paper you just did for me, the Taking Sides paper. The fact that people are still debating about who started World War I, was it the Germans or someone else? Why do they care so much? Because there is no doubt about who started World War II, Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. And German historians and the German public have some difficulty stomaching the idea that the two most devastating wars in the history of humankind were started by Germans, according to this guy Fritz Fischer, as well as Bergon, who wrote the yes side of that Taking Sides debate. Nobody argues that Hitler was responsible for the outbreak of World War II in Europe. So, those are one of those legacies. This is Europe after World War I. There is no more Austro-Hungarian Empire. In its place, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary. There is no more Serbia. Remember Serbia? Serbia that had wanted to expand its territory, and the Austrians hated Serbia for always instigating the Slavic peoples in their empire for independence. Well, at the end of it, Serbia got what it wanted. No more Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Serbia is now expanded to become Yugoslavia, that brings together Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Croatia, Slovenia, etc. It's Bosnia and Herzegovina. Romania expands. Poland is now back on the map. There was no Poland before World War I. It was divided between Germany, Austria, and Russia. These states here were not independent. These were all taken from Russian territory as the Russians fell to the revolution. There is no more Ottoman Empire. Now it's an independent Turkey. And Italy expands a little bit by getting all this land up here that used to be Austrian. What does all this mean? It means that some people got what they wanted, which was all Romanians are now living within Romania. The Poles now have their own state. The Czechs and the Slovaks have their own state. Those people are more or less happy. But there's a lot left that are unhappy. The Germans, for instance, they lost all this territory in the east. They feel humiliated by that Paris peace treaty, the Versailles peace treaty. Remember the reparations, the destruction of their army, their navy, etc. They want revenge. The French are paranoid that the Germans are going to rise up again and invade them for a third time in 50 years. The British, they're afraid of getting sucked into a World War II, so they don't want to get involved in the continent while people are working out their frustrations. Italy, they won World War I, but felt they were cheated at the peace table. They felt they didn't get everything that they were promised. So now they're unhappy. What does all this really amount to? If you are the people unhappy with your government at the end of World War I, and those governments happen to be democratic governments, then especially in Germany and Italy that have young democracies, democracy crumbles. And in its place you have dictatorships. And it is these dictatorships which lead us to World War II, which we'll be talking about in the next little while. So, this I've already gone through. So let's start off with the instability in Europe after World War I, which leads to the rise to power and the solidification of the dictatorships, Bolshevism in Russia, fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, which eventually leads us to World War II. First off, the Paris Peace Treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. We did this, somebody summarized this in our last class. The Peace Treaty of Versailles was meant to end World War I and finally rebuild Europe and the world. What did it do? It just upset a number of people. First off, the Germans. As I mentioned, they lost land. They were forced to pay reparations. They were held responsible for this war when they were convinced that everybody was responsible. The reparations were particularly problematic because the British and the French insisted that Germany pay them to help rebuild their economies. The Germans felt it was incredibly unfair that they had to rebuild everyone else's economy, but the British and French had no option. The Americans wanted to get payback, and the British and the French couldn't do so unless the Germans paid them. So you had this cycle of economic not development, essentially, unable to put it into better terms than that. National groups. When Woodrow Wilson came to Europe and brought America into World War I, he said, we're going to win this war, we're going to have a just peace. Everyone is going to have their own nation. We're going to break up the empires. Did this happen? Yes, it did. But a lot of people felt frustrated with the new boundaries. For instance, over here, this new boundary of Czechoslovakia, the Czechs and the Slovaks were very happy. But there was a bunch of Hungarians living inside Czechoslovakia, a bunch of Germans living along the border, etc., etc. There were a number of Poles stuck up here in Gdansk or Danzig. All of this means this was a natural consequence of the big Austro-Hungarian Empire surviving for hundreds of years and people mixing and moving. Then all of a sudden you draw an artificial barrier and people find themselves on the wrong line, on the wrong side of the line, and they're upset. They want to be joined with their homeland. So they agitate for change. And the French, their endless paranoia that having withstood the German attack in World War I, they couldn't possibly do it again. And so they were looking for any reason to keep the Germans down, to punish them at the first sign of breaking the Treaty of Versailles. All of this meant that nobody can get on with their life. The Germans couldn't rebuild their economy. There was always a threat of a new war. And Germany was the strongest economy in Europe. You keep that down, Europe cannot rebuild. So, then you have some basic economic problems. Like I mentioned, the Germans couldn't rebuild because of the reparations. The French, however, said, you have to pay, regardless. What is the result of this? In 1923, the French invade Germany to take over their natural resources, to force them to pay reparations. Because the Germans by 1923 said, we just can't pay according to the schedule you've imposed on us. The French didn't believe them. Well, how did the Germans respond? They responded by simply going on strike. They didn't have the military to push the French out. The government called a general strike, meaning everybody stopped working. When you stop working, you're not producing new goods. What do you think happens to the price of the stuff that has already been produced and it's in the warehouses and the stores? You mean people buy it? It decreases in supply. But let's say you're the owner of all this stuff. What do you do with the price if you know? Yes. The demand goes through the roof because you don't have replacements coming from the factories because of a general strike. The idea was, if the French are going to invade our country to take our stuff in order to turn that into reparations payments, we'll simply stop producing stuff. We won't mine the coal. We won't produce the steel, etc., etc. Well, what is the long-term consequences? Hyperinflation. The price of basic goods, stuff that people couldn't do without. Food, bread from the bakery, meat, coal for the winters. The price went through the roof. You could not drink coffee, but you couldn't not have coal in the middle of the winter. So people now started going into their savings to buy basic things to live on. What does that mean? The poor knew hardship. They'd always been poor. This just made it harder. But what gets dangerous is people that have gotten used to a comfortable quality of life. They've always had food. They've always had coal, warmth. They've always had a warm coat for the winter. Now all of us, and they've always had money in the bank for vacations, saving for the future, whatever the case may be. Now with hyperinflation, the middle class is wiped out in Germany, right? These are the most conservative members of society who just don't want too much trouble. They want to work, pay their taxes, and go on with their life. Now, overnight, they're wiped out, and they're facing economic hardship. Who do you blame? Well, the French, but also your government that let this happen. The German democratic government let this happen. So democracy in Germany takes a hit. And I'll talk about this later. There were attempts at a military uprising against democracy in Germany, led by Hitler, which failed in 1923. The only way German democracy survived is because the Americans jumped in. The Americans finally realized in the mid to late 20s that the only way the Americans will get paid back is if the British and French get paid back by Germany. But Germany is an economic mess. How do we get Germany back on its feet? We have to lend them money. Well, who's got the money to lend them? Only the Americans. The Americans lend money to the Germans. They rebuild, modernize their economy. The German economy really starts to develop again. And when the economy works, nobody's paying attention to radical politics, either on the left or the right. And democracy is stabilized in Germany until the Great Depression. The other problem that the Europeans are having is simply that the world has gotten smaller. What does that mean? Europe used to be the center of the global economy, both industrial and agricultural. During World War I, that global trade was interrupted. Why? Because of war. The sea lanes were closed either by the British or the Germans. In that time, people went elsewhere for their basic agricultural goods, wheat, cotton, whatever the case may be. When the war was over, the international sea lanes opened up again. Europe found itself facing competition. Modern technology had now made it rather cheap for people to shop anywhere they wanted for the cheapest products ever. You no longer had to shop locally for grain. If it was being grown in Western Canada, Western United States, South America, Russia, you just shopped wherever it was cheapest because transportation had become so inexpensive. Europe was facing a global competition. Agriculture prices went down. Farmers lost profit. And when farmers lose profit, industry suffers. They're buying less tractors, less feed, less fertilizer, and so on and so on and so on. When industry suffers, then you have layoffs, and you have this economic cycle that just Europe couldn't get itself out of. Now, in the 1920s and early 30s, everybody had these economic challenges, the sort of rebuilding economically after World War I. In the countries that had long-term democratic histories, like Britain, they had a constitution since, well, the idea of a constitution, that these are the king's responsibility, these are parliament's responsibilities, since 1215. And of course, the Glorious Revolution, we talked about that, the English Bill of Rights, a long history of democracy and checks and balances. Britain survived the economic challenges of the 1920s and 30s. France, they had the French Revolution in 1789. By the time this happened, they had a long tradition of democracy that had faced a lot of challenges and survived. Italy, on the other hand, Italy only had democracy, real democracy, with all men, not women, all men being allowed to vote in 1912, 2 years before World War I breaks out. They had no idea how democracy worked in practice when you have a real crisis. Germany, they were an autocratic monarchy until Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to quit the throne in 1918. So democracy was also very young in Germany. And the Russians, well, they had the most absolutist form of government up until the revolution, and then they had another form of dictatorship. There was a very little interregnum or a split of time where they had functioning democracy. And it is in Russia, Germany, and Italy where you see the dictatorships emerge, which is what we're going to talk about over the next little while. So, the very first thing for the rest of this class, what I want to look at is Russia under the Bolsheviks. Covered this a couple of classes ago. 1917, the Russian army is being decimated in World War I. The Tsar or King of Russia is the commander-in-chief of the army. So the failure of the Russian army is seen as a failure of the Russian monarchy. We also talked about how this was an incredibly absolutist system. There was really no room for political reform. You remember Peter Kropotkin? Remember Peter Kropotkin from the second Taking Sides paper you did? And how he argued that the only real change that will come to Russia is when you smash the existing system of government, because there's no free press. The political police is everywhere. You can't organize for peaceful change because the Tsar and his government will simply arrest anyone on grounds of treason. So the only solution left is violence, anarchist violence, right? So the Bolsheviks take power in 1917, and immediately they are faced with, how do we put socialism into practice? The notion of the state, the government, controlling all property, the entire economic system. How do we put this theory of Karl Marx into reality? Before I get to this, I want to turn it over to Selma and Lenin's What Is to Be Done, and Lenin offered the strategy of victory, building on Karl Marx's theory, which we all looked at before, and then I'll look at the different ways that socialism was put into practice. So, Vladimir Lenin, I brought him up a couple of classes ago, the head of the Bolshevik Party, the leader of the Russian Revolution. There he is, Vladimir Lenin. An iconic photograph. No one ever smiles. Actually, I found a picture of Lenin petting a cat, but it looked far less vicious, and I didn't want to give you the wrong impression. This is generally what he looked like. Now, he had the blueprint for victory. As you remember Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, we looked at this a few weeks ago. The notion that capitalism is so awful, it will produce so many poor and struggling people that they will eventually, all by themselves, realize that they all have a common enemy, the bourgeoisie. They're economic exploiters. Jennifer, they're economic exploiters. Stay awake, okay? Now, and once everybody realizes that all the workers of the world have got the same enemy, then they all come together in the city, in the state, across the world, and they know there's more of them than there are of the bourgeoisie. They will rise up and capitalism will be demolished. There'll be no more private property. Everybody will have equal access to all of the country's natural resources. And then we have no more poverty, right? That was written in 1848. This hadn't happened yet by World War I. Lenin, when he wrote this thing, said, this is how to bring a socialist revolution. So, Sama, take it away. What do you got for us about Vladimir Lenin's What Is to Be Done?
Lenin's primary goal in What Is to Be Done document and his means of achieving it. Lenin wanted to have socialism according by Marxism, which is the part of making stronger trade unions and union activities that can arise from the spontaneity of the working class who are struggling to make a revolution with their employer about the issue of wage and safe working place. Lenin wants to make revolution for legal rights and thinks that all labor have to combine and create an organization under a strong leading leader. The labor leader has to be knowledgeable about all of society matters such as economic, political, and the theoretical to lead people for revolution according by politics and Marxism. In addition, the leader has to be able to combat with political police and government to become successful over them. In that way, revolution will achieve and people will get a national leader from all classes of society to understand and fulfill their needs for peace, bread, and land. A knowledgeable leader can lead the country with proper directions by following democracy. Because during the 19th century rising of Bolshevik revolution, communism, fascism, and capitalism was a threat for legitimate government all over the world, and Lenin's goal was to establish revolutionary socialism in the large sea of depression of government policy.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask you this. Does he see workers and revolutionaries as the same thing?
No.
No. What do workers mostly want from their day-to-day life? What do they want?
They want their needs.
Right, their needs.
Yeah.
Their decent pay, decent working conditions.
Yeah.
Right? Does this make them natural revolutionaries?
Not actually.
No. Right? Because to be a good revolutionary, what kind of skills do you need according to Lenin? Eileen, you look like you have an answer. You don't? Okay, I'm sorry. What skills do you need to be a good revolutionary? Workers are good at working, possibly forming unions, right, to get better working conditions. But what skills do you need to be a good revolutionary? Louis?
Cause.
What?
A cause.
A cause. All right, keep going.
You need good leadership to be able to speak to people, have them understand equally as a whole.
All right, so you need to be able to organize. You need to actually communicate the reason for rebellion. What else? In the back, Robert.
Lenin defines revolutionaries as people who make it their profession to prepare themselves philosophically and theoretically on what it is they're fighting for, so that they can effectively communicate those aims of the people. So that there lies the difference between the trade unionists who fight for short-term goals to better working conditions, better pay, and the revolutionaries who address political goals like equality, democratic rights, civil liberties, so on and so forth.
Thank you. But my original question is still left unanswered. What skills do you need to be an effective revolutionary in a undemocratic, autocratic, absolutist state like Tsarist Russia, according to Lenin? What do you need?
Skills of persuasion.
What's that?
Skills
Are you
of
guessing?
No, I'm saying skills of persuasion. You need to be able to persuade somebody as old
Okay,
or stubborn.
let me break it down in much more simple ways. You are in a country where there are spies everywhere that report on anything that you say, which is even vaguely critical of the existing way of doing things, right? Your skills of persuasion will mean nothing, because what happens when you start speaking in public or publishing your views? What do you think will happen? You will be arrested or killed or whatever the case may be. So in order to gather a large enough group of people to overwhelm this opposition, according to Lenin, what do you need?
You have to be a political, you have to be a thinker, like a political way, and you have to present you like with an idea, then you can fight with those
You need to know how the system works, right? The spies, you know, how do they work? How to evade them,
and
right?
you have to have the ability to fight with those political leaders, because without the knowledge you can't actually go against them.
Okay, all right, very good. Robert again?
They need to operate in secret. They need to work in very secret, small circles, so they can evade capture, they can evade being reported on.
Exactly. In order to form a union, do you work in secret or in public?
Public.
To form a union.
Oh, to form a union that's public because
In
you want
public,
to
because you want people to know, hey, we're here, come join the union. Our strength is our numbers. But to form a revolutionary group, you have to get them in secret, and you only reveal yourself when you come out of a quote-unquote closet to take power. Workers are great at forming unions and publicly reaching out, saying, hey, you have the same problem we do. Form a union. Let's fight for better wages. Revolutionaries are great at revolution. Not forming unions, but there are spies in our midst. We have to meet secretly. What are our goals, et cetera, et cetera. What Stalin says is workers are mostly concerned about their needs. I have said this to you a number of times. Revolutions are made by the intellectuals, by the intelligentsia, the people who are not working 8, 9, 10 hours a day trying to get their next meal. They are the ones that have enough education and basically free time to sit around and say, how do we break the cycle of just work, and I'm still poor? How do we break the cycle? Remember the philosophers of the Enlightenment, right? Remember the scientific revolutionaries of the scientific revolution? Remember all those guys? Thomas Jefferson? Were any of these people workers? No. They wrote books, speeches, right? They thought about, this is what we've done in the past, how do we do it better? And then they became leaders of a movement. The movement were workers and other people. Karl Marx, was he a worker? No, he was a journalist. All of these people wrote about society's problems. Vladimir Lenin was a professional revolutionary, an intellectual. His idea was how to change society. The muscle of his revolution were the workers, the peasants, the soldiers. But the leaders were intellectuals of varying degrees. And by intellectuals, I'm using a very specific sense. I'm not talking about a smart person. I mean someone who is not only educated, but has a particular role in society to sort of critique the way things are done, to offer people an alternative. Okay? They don't have to be in politics. They don't have to be on TV. But they have to actually critically think, I don't know, like, let me see, how can I, you know who fulfills this role nowadays in our society? Before, and this is a bit of a stretch, but follow me on this one, okay? Just follow me on this one. The Reverend Al Sharpton. Everybody know the Reverend Al Sharpton? Like, how can you not? Before, he was a guy on television just yelling about civil rights abuses, right? I mean, being interviewed. Now he's got his own show, right? He's got his own show. He's interviewing people. He's making public statements. He is now helping to shape policy in a different, more elevated way. Cornel West, another intellectual that comments on society, specifically race, class, and issues of poverty. So that's what Lenin is looking for. Real leadership of a movement, people that actually know how to beat the existing people in power. Okay? Essentially, Lenin was tired of waiting for the revolution to come. Marx said the revolution was going to come by itself because people were so miserable and unhappy with capitalism. It's 1917 and it ain't coming. So how do you push it along? You need leaders that know how to organize the people and to trigger the revolution. And he did so in 1917. So, coming back to now that the revolution is won, Robert.
Do you want to address the differences between what is to be done in the Communist Manifesto?
Why don't you?
Okay.
I think I covered it briefly, but you seem to have some thoughts. Go.
Right. So in the short reading that we were given for the Communist Manifesto, Marx explicitly states that whatever actions is taken on behalf of the working class towards the revolution should be done out in the open, with an open face, open aims. Whereas Lenin does a complete 180 on this. It's like, no, secret groups is the only way that we're going to survive. It's the only way we're going to get anything done. So that's why, we call it Marx-Leninism, because they agreed so heavily, but critics of Lenin also say that he betrayed some of Marx's tenets because he advocated secrecy. And even in power, he advocated for the use of secret police to prevent infiltrators, saboteurs, and the like.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's a glaring contrast between the two philosophers.
Thank you very much. So, how do we go from this ideal that once capitalism is destroyed and the state representing all the people equally distributes property for everyone's benefits, how do we go from that to the dictatorship of the Soviet Union? It's trial and error and the death of Lenin is what it comes down to in a incredibly simplified fashion. As soon as the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, they were faced with civil war, the anti-Bolsheviks. So they were fighting against Russians that wanted to topple the Bolsheviks from power. They were also fighting, and Robert, this is for you, against the Americans, the Japanese, the British, the French, that sent armies to Russia to help destroy the Red Army and the Bolsheviks in power. Now, in that time, communism in practice was known as war communism. The idea where the state just simply takes over everything. The banks, the transportation facilities, railroads, etc., heavy industry that makes the tractors, the naval ships, the merchant marine, the tanks increasingly. And you have to feed your army, so food is taken forcefully from the peasantry who were just most recently given control of their own land, because you have to feed the workers in the factory and the armies in the field. By 1920, Lenin recognized the war was being won, but the Russian people, the peasants for whom this revolution was done, were turning against the idea of communism because they were having their food, what they grew, just simply seized from them. So he backpedaled. Beginning in 1921, Lenin implemented the new economic policy. The war by this point was coming to an end. Bolshevism was victorious, and so he was in a position to loosen the government's reins over various aspects of the economy. What it came down to was the government still controls the big things: banking, heavy industry, control of international trade, transportation. But small private enterprise, small shops, small farms are allowed to exist. Essentially the reintroduction of private property when before it had been completely smashed. Because Lenin recognized, as much as he probably hated to admit it, that people work best when they are motivated by the possibility of preserving some of the profits of what they work for. And as a consequence, the economy started to rebound in the mid to late 20s. But then Lenin dies. He suffers a stroke in 22 and dies shortly thereafter. Because Lenin took power in a revolution, and he immediately established the dictatorship of the Bolshevik Party, eliminating free press, parliament, opposing political parties. It was power taken by force. So when Lenin died so quickly after having taken power, there wasn't these well-regulated and developed steps for who comes next. So then what happens? Competition for power. Who gets enough support within the Bolshevik Party to be recognized as the next leader? Two primary people emerge as the next potentials. And we do not have Lorenzo here, and that is unfortunate. But we do have Jezmil, right? We have Stalin. You'll do Stalin. So let me give you a brief overview of Trotsky. Leon Trotsky was a true intellectual, right? Eloquent with the pen, but also a brilliant organizer. When the war broke out, he was the guy who pretty much created the army, the Bolsheviks' army, the Red Army that won the Civil War. He had tremendous respect within the Bolshevik Party and tremendous power. But with all that power, he also had a lot of rivals and a lot of enemies. Now, when he was being considered for the next in line for the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, people basically they looked at what he was going to offer. What direction was he going to take communism in if he is given power? His ideas are pretty straightforward. Russia will only survive if we industrialize like the Western powers and become as strong as they are so that we can never be victimized again. And the only way that communism will survive in Russia is if we spread communism to the rest of the world and we have allies everywhere. Okay? Those were Trotsky's ideas. His immediate competitor was Joseph Stalin. And Stalin's on the left. This is Trotsky on the right. You could already tell the difference in demeanor. The pure intellectual and Stalin, who always had a certain military bearing and was more about strength than subtlety. Jezmel, what'd you find out about Stalin? Tell me what you got. Tell us what you got.
I found that Joseph Stalin, he became the dictator.
Can you speak up, please, for everyone?
He became the dictator from 1929 up until his death in 1953. He when he was young, he was born in poverty, and he was involved he got involved into revolutionary political party, and also he was doing criminal stuff related. He changed the Soviet Union into an industrial and military superpower. He also crushes everybody who opposed him, such as like you said, everybody in parliament and his opponents. Some of them were executed, well, most of them were executed, and some of them were put into forced labor camps. From the research that I did, I found that about 20 million people died that were executed by him. The rest of the stuff that I got is past that. So you want me to talk about that? Like World War II.
How far? World War II?
Yeah, and some stuff that he did before he died.
Why don't you hold on to that, and we'll get to it when we get to World War II. All right? So just mental note. I'm going to you for World War II, Stalin, and the Cold War. All right? Thank you. So the one thing that Jezmel said that I want to bring your attention to, in this competition for power, Stalin positioned himself as the exact opposite of Trotsky. His argument was, keep Lenin's policy going, the new economic plan, the policy, because it's working. The economy's rebounding. The people are more or less happy. Don't change anything. Don't change everything to immediately industrialize Russia. Also, we can't spread socialism or communism outside of Russia. Why? Because nobody likes us. We've already had foreign invasion during the Russian Civil War, which we just barely pushed back. We don't want to invite more foreign invasion by interfering in other nations' political systems. Now, this is what the Bolshevik Party wanted to hear. Go ahead.
Professor, may I add?
You may add whatever you like.
Trotsky. So, as you said, after Lenin passes away, there was a vacuum of power, so they wanted to fill it quickly. Trotsky took the position now known as the left opposition to Bukharin's right position and Stalin's centrist position. Trotsky advocated permanent revolution, which is his export of communism aggressively throughout the world, and Stalin's philosophy of socialism in one country would restrict socialism to Russia. Similar things would happen during the Chinese Civil War, which would lead to the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, so on and so forth. Eventually, Trotsky loses the battle and is forced into exile for the rest of his life until an assassin by Stalin effectively kills him in Mexico.
In Mexico. And do you know with what weapon?
An ice pick.
An ice pick. An ice pick. Stalin tracks down Trotsky, according to the PowerPoint. Thank you, Robert. In 1940. He tracks him down in 1940. Stalin had achieved power in 1929, but 11 years later, Trotsky, who has been fleeing for his life throughout Europe and now overseas, Stalin still thinks he is a threat. And he finally tracks him down and has him assassinated with an ice pick.
Is there any symbolism to that?
Symbolism to using an ice pick? I dislike you, and I want you to die with as much pain as possible. I don't know if it's symbolism or just a message. Now, let me take us to Stalin. Upon Trotsky's elimination, what did Stalin do? He reversed position and he took on all of Trotsky's ideas. It wasn't that he disagreed with Trotsky's ideas. He just wanted Stalin. He wanted power. And Stalin wasn't an idiot. He was a moderate intellectual, but he was not stupid. He recognized if you want Russia to be strong, it has to be strong like everyone else. So just like the Japanese, upon their humiliation when the Americans forced open their country to Western trade and they modernized aggressively, Stalin did the same thing, except in Stalin's Russia, the consequences were much more severe. So for him, this rapid industrialization came in two stages. The first thing you had to do was take over farming and all agriculture, because where's the money going to come from? in order to invest in industrialization. Well, what does Russia do? It grows a lot of things, which can be sold overseas, and those funds used for the industrialization of Russia. So this is the very first thing done, the collectivization of agriculture. The state takes over farming, which for the last 10 years had been more administered by the local peasants on their own private property. Many resist, which were known as the kulaks, and the government enforced their control over these people, reorganizing and relocating many people in order to have broad, collectivized, state-run farms. The result of this was massive famine. Ukraine has been in the press lately a lot because the Russians have seized the Crimea from Ukraine, and now they are agitating to take over eastern Ukraine because Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union. But in the 1930s, Ukraine was in the news for a different reason. Much of the opposition to the state's overtaking of land came from that part, Ukraine, where much of the agriculture, the wheat, was grown. Stalin considered this a personal attack against himself and the institution of communism, and he forcefully requisitioned this food from these people in order to sell overseas to get the money to industrialize Russia. What was the problem? These people had nothing to eat because all of it was seized in order to be sold overseas to industrialize the country. And the result was upwards of 10 million people dying by forced famine. I don't have time to do this, but that video, which I could send you links to after all, gives you an idea, and maybe I might have time at the end, of what famine in the Ukraine looked like. But this was successful. By the end of the 1930s, 90% of the land was in the state's hands. The income from the land was being used by the state in order to industrialize the country, which takes us to Lamia and the 5-year plans, goals to industrialize the country quickly. Tell me about the 5-year plans, Lamia.
In 1928, Joseph Stalin started the 5-year plan with the goal to modernize the Soviet industry. Stalin claimed that USSR was 15 to 100 years behind the West, and that if it did not make up this gap within 10 years, the West would bury them. The 5-year plans were Stalin's method of modernizing the country's industry. New dams for hydroelectricity, new roads, new steel and metal plants were created. New lines linked and new canals dug. Economically, they were a success, enabling the Soviet Union to not feel the effects of the Great Depression. In fact, to benefit from it, as they needed machinery and the expert operators to train their workers, and the West was keen to sell them the machines and operators were available to go to the USSR to work for them. Politically, the 5-year plan were a success. They consolidated Stalin's position as supreme leader, and they were ideologically more Marxist than the previous policy, the new economic policy, which pleased many in the party. Socially, the results are mixed. Initially, there were great enthusiasm for them, and many people volunteered to work on the grand project. The country was electrified, and many new jobs were created. But political prisoners were used as workers on many of them, notably the Belmore Canal, and many people died as a result. As for collectivization, this too came as a result of Stalin's changing political stance toward greater government control. Collectivization was thought to be a way to increase crop yields and make USSR better able to feed its own people. Quite the contrary, it distanced villages and caused more fights than anything, and eventually large-scale collectivization efforts came to a first step.
Thank you very much. So a couple of things Lamia said which are critical here. The 5-year plans were an incredible success at modernizing and industrializing the Soviet Union in a short period of time. Something up to industrial production goes up 400% in a 12-year period, which is, of course, Russia began the Soviet Union at a very low level, but a 400% increase is remarkable. Like, we don't see those kinds of changes except for China nowadays, which itself started at a very low level of industrialization and then just leapfrogged once it focused purely on that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and today. But the other thing is, all the money went into essentially heavy industry, not consumer products. So just to give you an idea of the irony that I'm talking about here, the communist revolution was done for the poor, the workers and the peasants, right? The peasants were first given land, then had it taken away when the state took over farming, and you had all that famine in the Ukraine, right? The workers were supposed to now be running the factories under a communist regime, no longer exploited by their former bourgeois employers, but they themselves, under the 5-year plans, are worked near to death, in some cases slave labor used, and quality of life goes down the toilet because consumer goods are not the priority in this new Russian industrial economy, right? And this type of hardship was incredibly unpopular, which led to Stalin's paranoia taking over. The man who chased down Trotsky 11 years after chasing him out of power and executed him, the man who forced into famine and death millions of Ukrainians on the assumption that they were betrayers of the communist ideal, had no patience for what he perceived to be lack of enthusiastic support for his leadership or these 5-year plans, and thus he purged his party and much of the leadership of the Soviet Union of any potential enemies, to which I give you Robert, who will talk about Stalin's purges.
Stalin conducted his purges between the years of 1934 and 1939. There were 4 waves of purges, and before his death, he was composing a list for the 5th. So, thank goodness he passed away. In Russia, this is known as the Yezovshchina, which means the Yezov regime. Yezov was the head of the NKVD, KGB later on, and today's FSB in Russia.
The spy agency.
Right. So there's secret police, etc., etc. So this is called because it was his signature that allowed for the arrest and interrogation of the suspects. That's very cunning on Stalin's part, since he had plausible deniability later on afterwards when, should this ever arise, his name wasn't on it, but he was very much the architect. In his purges, he sought to eliminate any political rivals or potential rivals down the road. So, beginning, he started with the old Bolshevik cadre. He eliminated them, of which, Trotsky was part of. Then he sought out the Red Army generals, which he saw as future rivals for power as well, which came to hurt them in World War II since they had very little leadership. And then he started purging the peasants themselves. He, in effect, carried out a war against the poor through his purges. Through his purges, he also managed to consolidate his power for many years because no one wanted to face up against him. The Central Committee then became a sort of rubber stamp agency for his policies, and he just had carte blanche when it came to Soviet Union's actions. Because of the purges, he was able to give himself the title Generalissimo, which is the ultimate title politically and militarily, and to which he exploited during World War II, especially when he met with the other 2, Winston Churchill and Roosevelt, during the Yalta conferences and such.
Thank you. So, something Robert said that I want to focus your attention on. After eliminating his rivals in his own party, the Bolshevik Party, which was the only party allowed to exist in the Soviet Union, and other potential rivals, he eliminated the leaders of the army and the military, the armed forces. This was a remarkable thing to do, to eliminate the leaders of the military forces, because Russia, the Soviet Union, had no friends. It had no friends. It had already been invaded once in its early history. And while he was industrializing and turning Russia into a modern industrial nation, he had no leadership of these new tools he was making. And when I talk about the origins of World War II and Russia's I'm sorry I'm using Russia and the Soviet Union interchangeably, and that's because Russia is the biggest part of the Soviet Union. When I talk about the beginning of World War II, you're gonna be stunned at how unprepared the Russians were for the German invasion and the consequences that resulted. Now, just to finish this off, these show trials that Robert was talking about, these were all forced confessions from people, forced to name names of other people. These people had to publicly state, I am working against Stalin. I am working against the 5-year plans. I am secretly in collusion with foreign governments. But it wasn't true. They were tortured into these things. Families were threatened, etc., etc. They were forced to name names. And these cycles continued. And the culture of fear was phenomenal in keeping people doing exactly what Stalin told them. So we have a little, and just to finish off, the result of these purges is upwards of 10 to 20 million dead. Okay? Now think about this. You have millions of dead from the famine, millions of dead from the purges, and these are all the documented dead. This is a secret dictatorship regime. Many things are not reported, because if your family member disappears in the middle of the night because government agents or some plainclothes people show up to your house and take away your brother, your uncle, your father, you're not going to report it for fear of you yourself meeting the same fate. Recent scholarship has brought this number of the purges far higher, far, far higher, mostly because of access to the archives of the Soviet Union that after it fell were now open. Yeah.
Can I just say, to illustrate how crazy this was, is that imagine after 1776, the founding fathers are put on trial and executed for leading the revolution that gave them new country. This is what happened to the Bolshevik cadre under Stalin.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Could you imagine that? George Washington going after Thomas Jefferson and Madison, etc. So, since we have a little bit of time, I want to show you a brief video documentary of what the Ukrainian famine looked like. Okay? Hopefully this works. Never quite know with the audio in here.
It may be 80 years now since millions of Ukrainians died in a famine, but the tragedy remains deeply controversial. The reasons behind it, the subject of heated debate. Details of what happened in Ukraine in 1932 and 33 remained buried for years in the archives of the Soviet Union, and they've proved hard to unearth even in these post-Soviet times. John Sweeney, who's been traveling in Ukraine, says the horrors of those days have not been forgotten.
There is something utterly bleak about eastern Ukraine. It eats into the soul. Dirt roads lead to grey wooden shacks that stand out against a dishcloth sky. Our taxi rouses the animals. At the end of rusty chains, dogs growl, geese clack. We're somewhere east of Kharkiv, in the very back of beyond. But around here live the last surviving witnesses to a great lie, one that's still being protected by the powers that be to the east in the Kremlin. Maria Drabitko was 17 when almost 8 decades ago the starving turned cannibal. Today her face etched with 93 years. She's incredibly frail, bent double, the skin on her face wreathed and folded, her hands gnarled, her steps tiny, bird-like. But her voice, when she talks, is firm, and she refutes the great lie with a passionate intensity. To say there was no famine is wrong, she said. There was no bread. People were swollen. Many, many died. Maria told us the story of a woman who lived in the village with her 2 children. Suspicion aroused, a neighbor checked on her, asking what had happened to her kids. To her horror, she noticed there was a hand sticking out of the stove. Asked why she'd eaten her own, the cannibal replied, because they were going to die anyway. Down the dirt road from Maria lived an old man and his wife. He told the story how as a young boy he was revolted to discover that his beloved granny had killed the family cat. He vowed not to eat it, but his granny insisted, and besides, the hunger was remorseless. so he ate Kitty. Even today, he seemed a little bit ashamed of this story. A third witness, an old lady whose father had died of hunger. She too used the same word, swollen, pointing up the counterintuitive fact that the bellies of the very hungry swell, proof of gross malnutrition. We took the train back to Kharkiv, met an old policeman who, as a very small boy, witnessed thousands queuing for bread and saw with his own eyes many, many corpses lying on the streets. Later, when he applied for a place at military college, he had to fill in a form about the death of his father. He wrote down the truth, that his father had died in the famine. He was advised, don't mention that. 79 years ago, all of these witnesses would have been shot for talking to me about the Holodomor, the death famine. Back in 1933, Eastern Ukraine was the epicenter of a terrible man-made famine caused by Stalin's mad war against the peasantry of Russia and Ukraine. Millions died. Nobody knows exactly how many millions because Stalin's secret police killed the truth. Useful idiots like George Bernard Shaw visited the Soviet Union, licked Stalin's boots and went along with the big lie that there was no famine. Journalists in Moscow were banned from the epicenter of the famine zone. But two reporters tried to get the truth out. One was Malcolm Muggeridge of the then Manchester Guardian, who managed to get to famine-stricken areas before the ban. The second was Gareth Jones, a Welshman and brilliant Russian speaker, who dodged the secret police by hopping on and off local trains. He walked through the famine zone, through empty villages like Maria's, and got back to the West and told the story. Enter Walter Duranty of the New York Times. A Liverpudlian, clever, witty, Duranty was a man with a crooked soul. Back in Paris before the First World War, he'd been associated with Aleister Crowley, the notorious occultist known as the Great Beast. In Moscow in 1933, Duranty pooh-poohed Jones's scoop. He reported there was malnutrition, but no famine. A few months later, Duranty told a diplomat at the British Embassy in Moscow that perhaps as many as 10 million people had died. But he added, they're only Russians. 2 years after Jones's great scoop, he was murdered in China. Later it came out that the company arranging his travel was a front for the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. Today, the man with the key to the secret police archive is Vladimir Putin, the once and, some say, future president of Russia. Under Putin, some of the truth about the famine is still being withheld. Maria and the other witnesses won't live much longer. But I hope that they will live long enough for the archives to be unlocked, for the full story to be told, and that includes naming those who ordered the killing of a lone reporter who dared to defy Stalin's will all those years ago.
So, in case it wasn't clear from this video, the regime denied the millions of dead. They hid this for years. And in this country, there were still supporters of Stalin as the successful version of socialism and denied the famine imposed on his own people. And actually, it's not that hard to find the same people today. Lewis, you still with me?
Yep.
All right. So think about that. Think about the power to not only impose its economic system on people, but to hide it from the rest of the world for as long as it was. Now, this is part one of the triumvirate of dictatorships. We'll look at fascism next class, and you have Mussolini's document, What is Fascism? And then Hitler's Nazism thereafter, and the New Deal. Thank you. Hand in your homework on the way out. I'll see you soon.
Is this 211?